Hi, back to 10 by 6. Rod Driver,
Indeed,
welcome.
thanks very much for having me on again.
And last week we looked at sort of psychology and the essence of how people are manipulated and molded. And I think it leads in nicely as well to this week's, because it's about how power rigs the economy. But you can only rig the economy, can't you, Rod, if you have, let's say, dutiful citizens who don't question you. And this also applies to one of the central tenets of this debate around the idea of this repetition of the phrase the free market, which I know you're now going to go on and explain isn't free, never has been free, and there's nowhere on the planet where it's free. And yet politicians just like to keep repeating this motif over and over and over. And it's like, you know, the old adage, repeat a lie often enough. And so over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much. That was a great introduction. So yes, for the next sort of 7 or 8 weeks, we're going to be talking about aspects of the economy. But if anybody out there is sort of terrified of anything related to economics, you don't need to worry. I didn't use any graphs, there's no maths. I talk about it in the way that economists used to talk about these things, because it used to be called political economy, because they realized you cannot separate politics from economics. And in fact, it's the relationship between powerful groups in the economy, so that can be rich people, it can be big companies, which is what we're going to focus on today. It's their relationship with politicians and the political system that actually determines how wealth becomes distributed at the end of the day through the population. So it's about power and it's about propaganda, and these are completely missing from economics textbooks. But in fact, all the things we're going to talk about today, they barely appear in a mainstream undergraduate economics textbook. And yet these are the things that determine how the world works. And in fact, Noam Chomsky made a documentary about this approximately 10 years ago called Requiem for the American Dream. And he pointed out that a key part of what goes on is the alignment of political power with corporate power. And this is something that is almost never discussed. People talk about the economy as if it's separate from government and separate from politics, but actually it isn't. They are so closely intertwined, they cannot be separated. And what we've ended up with in Britain and America is a really extreme economic system, which is all about corporate power and corporate profit trumping everything else, irrespective of the harms to the rest of society. So economists talk about an expression which they call free lunches. That means sometimes in the economic system, some groups of people are able to get money or get profit without really doing very much. So a simple example of this is when the value of your house goes up because the government have built a railway station nearby. So that's called a free lunch. You didn't have to do anything to earn that extra wealth. Well, in fact, there are free lunches everywhere in the economic system, and many of them accrue to a very small number of powerful people or organizations. And so we call it, when we're talking about big companies, I use the expression excess profits. So there's a myth that rich people and big companies earn their profits. Nothing could be further from the truth. A large proportion of their wealth is money that is basically handed to them for doing nothing. So it's excess profits. In the past, economists would have called these rents, and we often use the term rent seeking to mean companies that try to manipulate the system to get these excess profits without doing anything. So the first part of what I'm going to talk about is one of the greatest propaganda terms in human history, certainly as far as economics is concerned, and that is the idea of a free market. It sounds like this wonderful phrase. People talk about creating a level playing field. How could anyone object to a free market and a level playing field? But actually, you can only ever have a level playing field when you don't have an imbalance of power in the first place. When you start out with great inequality, that money that some players have, the biggest companies have, that tilts the playing field massively in their favor. So a long time ago, the famous economist Adam Smith used to write about the magical hand of the market. And a lot of right-wing commentators who often kind of represent this, what I call this worship the market idea, they'll often cite Adam Smith. But in fact, if you look at Adam Smith's writing, he was very precise that this idea of letting the market sort of work out what should happen only applies when you have large numbers of small businesses, each with no power. He was very clear to say that it will not work if you try to apply the same idea to a small number of big businesses, which each have immense power. He pointed out that all you end up with is corruption and cheating and so on. So what we notice if we study the modern world is that in many industries, they are dominated by either one company that controls the marketplace or a small number of big businesses. So if it's one company controlling the market, we call that monopoly. If it's a small number of companies, we call that oligopoly. Now, when companies are big and powerful, they can manipulate prices. They will often have informal agreements where they will limit their competition with each other to bring prices down. So this means they can overcharge customers. And there's specific areas of society that sort of tie in with this. So some people will be familiar with the concept of a patent. Now, we are actually going to do a presentation about patents later on. A patent is a sort of legal document that gives you the right to control an invention. But in fact, you have to understand that a patent, it also ends up being basically a license to print money, a license to overcharge all your customers because there is no competition. And this is particularly powerful in the software industries, but also medicine industries, so what we call the pharmaceutical sector. So the important thing to understand is that money is power, and it's about saying we create a society which is £1, one vote. The more money you have, the more influence you have. So this is very different from what people think of in terms of democracy. So if you look at what big companies can do specifically, they do masses and masses of advertising. Now, lots of people think that advertising is about getting information, but in fact, its main purpose is to create dominance by one or a small number of companies in any industry, because people are just very familiar with the companies that have very big advertising budgets. They advertise all the time. Big companies also have armies of lawyers and tax specialists. Now, they play many roles within our societies. One of the things they try to do is to make corporate structures incredibly complicated. So they try and set up subsidiaries and holding companies offshore in tax havens to avoid paying tax. And lots of tax specialists have admitted that often the tactics that they come up with to help big companies and rich people avoid paying tax are mostly probably illegal, but they never get tested in court. So the whole purpose of these lawyers and these tax specialists is to work out how to bend, break, and ultimately make the rules, because these people lobby the government. We've talked about lobbying and revolving doors, and the idea that somebody from government can come and work in a big business, somebody from big business can come and work for government, and essentially the biggest companies end up making their own rules. And what they strive for is less regulation to allow them to do more and more things that probably ordinary people would think of as unethical. So they can pay bigger bribes. In Britain and America, what I call bribery is sort of legalized. It's built into the system in terms of funding elections and so on. Overseas, the bribes are clearly illegal, but they have the power to get away with it. So they will try to do their best to manipulate the regulators, and they will get senior staff working in regulators, and they will make sure the regulators have very little power to stop them doing their unethical or criminal activities. They also have very deep pockets to establish dominance. So if you look at the business model of Uber, it paid drivers very well to start with, and it allowed customers to have very cheap journeys. What it's trying to do is to become the dominant taxi company. Once it's become dominant, it will then decrease the amount it pays to its drivers, and it will put up prices. And it's very, very difficult for people to move elsewhere. And so this is called first mover advantage. Once you've established dominance, it's very, very hard for anyone to compete with you. And so with Uber in America, there's been good research on this. They started out paying their taxi drivers approximately $40 per hour. Once they were dominant, this eventually dropped to about $9 an hour, at which point it becomes very, very difficult for Uber drivers to make a decent living. And this first mover advantage is incredibly important in some industries, particularly these days with technology companies, where if you are Facebook and you've got millions of users who all use Facebook, nobody wants to move to a different platform because all your friends aren't on that other platform. So it becomes very difficult for anyone to compete. So first mover advantage is hugely important, and having lots of money to establish that dominance is also hugely important. So big companies have very deep pockets. But there are many other ways in which big businesses have advantages. So they can buy related businesses, and ultimately they're able to control the whole supply chain in an industry. So quite famously throughout history, the oil companies have tried to make sure they do as much of the drilling, extracting the oil out of the ground as possible. They're not always able to control that these days because governments ultimately want to do that themselves. But they do control the refinery process, which is where a lot of the profits are made. But they also all control a lot of the petrol stations, and so they get the end layer of profit from selling direct to the customer. So they can make multiple layers of profit. And so for many years, the oil industry had been one of the most profitable industries year after year after year. And what we're also seeing, and we're going to talk about this a lot in later sessions, is what happens internationally. So countries overseas are being forced to implement this extreme economic system focused on corporate profits, even if they don't want to, because of the ability of the US government and other international organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, to apply pressure as a condition of loans. So big companies are benefiting from the ability of their most powerful governments to force other countries to open up their economies so that big, powerful companies can dominate. So Noam Chomsky talks about a very specific thing, which he uses the phrase really existing capitalism, which is his way of saying, look, the version of capitalism that you think exists on television, coming from the mainstream media, from the politicians, or in an economics textbook, is not what really goes on. Some people would call the real version of capitalism crony capitalism. So the idea is this powerful relationship between government and business. So if you look at a very obvious area where governments give money to big companies, so we call this subsidies. In the UK, the latest research I saw said that the total subsidies per year from government to business is about £90 billion. That's an enormous proportion of the economy. And most of that goes to very big companies that mostly don't need any subsidies at all. And a chunk of that money ends up in the pockets of executives and shareholders. In the US, one study a few years ago said the total subsidies was $800 billion. And it may be much bigger than that now. So it may actually be over $1 trillion. And so as well as the government directly giving money to these big companies, they also give guaranteed contracts where they will buy, let's say, some weapons from a weapons company, and it will be at a very high price. So the weapons companies will be extremely profitable. So there's a number of industries where we see these factors working. So there was a banking bailout in 2008 after the financial crisis, where the amount of money that government provided to the banking system was absolutely astronomical. Other industries would include the pharmaceutical industry, where governments provide contracts. We've seen that recently in relation to vaccines. In the oil industry, governments provide a huge amount of support. And what people don't realize is the support that governments give to businesses can work in lots of different ways. So if you're talking about the oil industry, every time Britain and America invade another country and overthrow a government and hand an oil contract to an oil company, that ends up being a massive subsidy to the oil companies. We also see big subsidies in the airline industry. Over the years, many people will have heard of European farm subsidies, which primarily go to the biggest farmers. There are investigations into government subsidies to the train companies and so on. In fact, it's a very, very widespread system. Many of the biggest companies get a great deal of their excess profits from government contracts and government subsidies. And in fact, one of the things we'll talk about in a couple of weeks' time is how people become multimillionaires and billionaires. And in fact, one of the main ways in which individuals become super rich is through industries that do receive massive support from governments. Governments also do a lot of the early research funding in various sectors, which then goes into the pockets of the private sector. So again, in the pharmaceutical industry, that happens a lot, especially in America. There's a lot of government-funded university research into new medicines, but the profits are then handed off to the private sector. But we see it in all sorts of industries. If you look at all of the modern tech companies, everything they've been able to achieve came about because in the post-war era, say 1945, for the few decades after that, the American government and the American military invested huge amounts of money into modern electronics and communications technologies. And everything that has sort of grown in Silicon Valley has spun off from there. So again, this research idea by the government and then profits handed to big business is very widespread. And what we've seen in the last couple of years in relation to either Donald Trump in America and very recently with Johnson in Britain, is that they were openly handing contracts to their cronies for equipment related to coronavirus, whether it's protective equipment or something else. And there was almost no scrutiny, no oversight. It was an entirely corrupt process. Often the companies receiving these contracts had no knowledge of the sector that they were being paid to work in. And there's just been a huge investigation by Private Eye, and you can probably still get this edition, where they're looking at how middlemen are getting paid tens of millions of pounds just for setting up contracts. So the whole system is clearly extraordinarily corrupt. So if we look at another area where big businesses get free lunch, economists have a particular word which they call externalities. Now, this can be kind of defined in a number of complex ways, but I use it to mean when companies don't really pay the full costs of their activities. So if you look at the depletion of resources such as oil, companies don't pay for that depletion. They pay to dig it out of the ground, but that cost is relatively small. Eventually, the easy to access oil will start to run out. Some people are suggesting that most of the oil that's very easy to access has been used, and the remaining oil, although there's very large quantities of it, is much harder to access and to process. Companies don't pay very much for their pollution. So the oil companies can be polluting, the mining companies have a huge, terrible track record for polluting in the regions near where their mine operations are, and this can be polluting the air, the water, and the soil, which can affect farmers, can affect the local drinking water, and so on. They're not currently paying anything for their global warming and their carbon emissions. And Michael Moore made a wonderful film some years ago called Roger and Me. And if people have never seen it and they're interested in this, it really is a wonderful example of how companies don't pay their costs. And it was about General Motors relocating their factory from Michael Moore's hometown, which was Flint, Michigan, and relocating overseas. And the company would save money by relocating to a cheaper location for its production in the future. But the end result in Flint, Michigan was that actually the whole town was dependent on the salaries earned by the workers in the GM factories. When those people were no longer earning those salaries, the local businesses that were dependent on them collapsed. And that created a sort of ripple effect where more and more businesses collapsed. And eventually the whole town, and this was a kind of major town, we would call it a city, collapsed and became a ghost town. And for decades, the living standards there were terribly poor. And we see health issues all over developing countries due to the activities of our companies and so on. And the companies never pay any cost for this. And we'll look at some more detailed examples of this in future weeks. So what we have is a situation where the profits are privatized into the hands of a small number of big companies, the executives and the shareholders, whilst the costs are socialized. That is, the costs are paid for all of us by society as a whole and by the governments. And these costs are enormous. So global warming basically swamps all other costs. It's going to be, such an enormous cost in the decades to come. But the interesting thing is, if you look at externalities in an economics textbook, whilst they do mention this, they don't really know how to deal with it because it's very hard to attach numbers to it. So it's hard to draw a graph and a curve and see where the line intersects the curve and work out anything from it. So in fact, economists just pretend that you can brush this under the carpet and pretend they're not there. But in fact, externalities probably swamp everything else that companies do. So we can't just ignore those costs. The costs are enormous. So there's really no justification for providing giant payments to executives and shareholders when there are so many subsidies and when there are so many costs being paid by the rest of society. So it was very interesting when the 2008 financial crisis took place. The banks basically destroyed the financial system. If governments hadn't stepped in to save the system, we could really have seen a Great Depression like happened in America in 1929. It would have been terrible. Fortunately, the system was saved. But what was interesting was the executives in those banks that brought the system crashing down still took home absolutely enormous paychecks, despite the harm that they had caused. So I sometimes use the phrase bloodsucker capitalism to describe what really goes on. Some people talk about predatory capitalism. Some people use the term neoliberalism, which I think is a good word, but it's just important to understand that we're always talking about the same thing. So there are a number of different ways in which big companies really extract wealth from everybody else's pockets. So the profit motive is meant to encourage innovation and efficiency. But in fact, what it's motivating these days is criminal activity, fraud, and exploiting others. So I tend to say that there are four groups of people who get exploited by big business. They try to rip off their customers by manipulating prices, having complex price structures, overcharging and having very little competition and so on. And there's also things like in the tech sector, particularly planned obsolescence, where you buy something, but the tech industry goes out of its way to make sure that within a few years, it won't work very well. It won't be up to speed with the latest software and so on. So you will have to pay out for the newest version. Now, interestingly enough, this is not a new phenomenon. So just this week, I was watching an interview that the former rapper Loki, so his name is Kareem Dennis, had done, and he's doing some very interesting interviews at the moment. And he was talking to people from a company that used to be called Lucas Industries. So they used to make weapons, and they were exploring how to make other things. Now, in the course of the interviews that took place with these people from Lucas Industries, they admitted that when they were making cars, there was a discussion that there was not enough profit being made in the windscreen wiper aftermarket, so replacement windscreen wipers. So the management actually decided to change the specification of the ball bearings in the windscreen wiper mechanism to make sure that it would wear out more quickly so that people would have to replace it and they could make more profit with the replacement. So this idea of making things that are poor quality or won't last very long is actually something that goes back through history of big business. And in fact, there was a thing in the most recent Which magazine, which was talking about how tech companies are starting to adopt what might be called the Easyjet model of making profits, where you think you've bought something and that's all you need, but in fact, to get any of the things that go with it costs a lot of extra money. And in fact, Apple computers have been doing this for a long time, where you pay a lot of extra money for chargers and so on. Well, more and more tech companies are doing this, where they charge you for the extra cables and the chargers, and they're very expensive. So that's the ripping off the customers. They also try to rip off their staff. Now, it varies from industry to industry. So sometimes they'll be doing fire and rehire, where your contract will get worse. Sometimes they'll decrease your pension. Sometimes they'll set up a subsidiary that's based offshore. And this is even happening in the university sector, where new staff are not recruited directly by the university, but they're recruited by the subsidiary, and the normal protections don't apply, and their contracts are worse than they would have been if they'd gone directly to the university. And then also they're trying to rip off suppliers. And you can see this particularly in the third world, but in fact, we're also seeing it in clothing companies in England, where people have very unfair contracts and people are ending up earning less than the minimum wage, and they're expected to produce a certain amount of goods in a certain time. And the whole system is manipulated. So if you study the cotton industry in Bangladesh, or the clothing sector in Bangladesh, you realize that there's huge numbers of people being exploited, so that companies in advanced nations can make huge amounts of money. And every now and again, that topic does get into the mainstream, where a major company such as Nike will be criticized because they're paying their suppliers so little, and yet they're selling their goods for such a huge amount of money and such a huge profit. And so the final group of people that they're trying to rip off is the government. And they do this with the say-so of the government. So they try to manipulate the tax system, and they try to lobby to get more subsidies. So they work with the government to get money from government coffers. So what we're seeing is that ordinary people are basically worse off multiple times over. Some companies are trying to exploit them on their pay and their working conditions. Other companies are trying to exploit them in terms of how much they'll pay for their goods and the costs of their goods. And then on top of that, if big companies are avoiding paying tax, and a government has a particular target in terms of how much tax it wants to receive in a particular year, then it will take the tax from somewhere else, and it will ultimately come out of the pockets of ordinary people. So what we've created is a system where the more companies and executives and shareholders can exploit others, that's every group of people they come into contact with, the more profit they can make. It's actually about pursuing inequality. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing inequality going through the roof in Britain, America, and many other nations at the moment. So they're actually ultimately destroying society. They're destroying the living standards of the poorer half of their populations. And one of the things that interests me is the idea of performance-related pay. And I've never seen anyone put forward the main arguments against executives being paid according to their performance. When we talk about their performance, we mean, has the share price of the company gone up? But actually what this means is they can get a bigger bonus if they can rip off their customers and their suppliers, and if they can rip off the government. So all of the unethical or criminal activities that big companies are doing, and we're going to talk a lot about corporate crime next week, partly it's motivated by the desire of executives to receive bigger bonuses. So if they can dump toxic waste off the coast of Africa and not have to pay anything for it, they get a bigger bonus. If they can rig the pharmaceutical industry so they lie about the benefits of their drugs and they understate the harms of their drugs, they'll get a bigger bonus. So the whole system is now geared to rewarding unethical and even criminal activity. And this is a discussion we really need to start to have. So I'm just going to sort of summarize a couple of additional areas where big companies are able to make free lunches, and then I'll open it up to discussion. So one of the things people talk about is privatization, and we're seeing that with the NHS. So where something that at the moment exists in the hands of the government and is provided either free or at a very low cost to most citizens, big companies want them to be handed over to them so they can exploit them for profit. And if you look at, say, the water supply, the sewage system, healthcare systems, transport, electricity, energy supplies, and even broadcasting spectrum, there are a number of economists who said, look, all of these should be run in a not-for-profit way. They are fundamental to the functioning of our societies. And once you allow companies to control them for profit, then actually they start manipulating the system and taking excess profits by rigging the system and so on. And I would even go so far as to say that currently the banking system and our pharmaceutical industry that makes medicines are not fit for purpose. And we'll talk about them in much more detail in future weeks, and that they also should be controlled by the government in a not-for-profit way. So there are one or two specific things that we've seen banks doing over the years. So they're actually involved with money laundering and making profits from drugs, very serious criminal activities. But all they ever get is a slap on the wrist. Sometimes it's a fine. It can be quite a big fine sometimes, but it's never enough to deter them from doing the things they do. And if you look at mining companies abroad or the oil companies abroad, there was a notorious incident, let's say, with Shell in Nigeria, where the Nigerian government were killing protesters in areas where Shell wanted to extract the oil. Well, the Nigerian government and Shell Nigeria are not separate entities. In fact, there's a very close relationship between the people in those two organizations. So actually the company itself is involved with killing people in order to get its oil. And this is not unique. Actually, mining companies all over the world have terrible human rights records and work with very, very criminal governments to get the things out of the ground that they're trying to mine. So this idea of excess profits or rent seeking was very, very well understood up until approximately the year 1900 or thereabouts. And then for some reason, economics in mainstream teaching sort of moved away from taking that seriously and discussing it at all. And it's now almost disappeared. It's touched upon a little bit in mainstream textbooks, but only as a kind of side issues. It's nice to see that there are one or two mainstream economists, particularly in the US, so people like Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz, who in the last few years have started to say, look, maybe there is a problem with monopoly and this extreme system of capitalism where the exclusive focus is on the profits of a tiny number of powerful companies. So on the whole, governments, executives, and shareholders don't want you to understand how this system works. And so if you look at the mainstream media coverage of big business and rich people, they're always labeled wealth creators. In fact, a lot of the time that isn't true. They simply know how the system is rigged, and they know how to play the system and how to work with government to extract wealth from the system. So sometimes you'll hear the expression trickle down. The theory is that very rich people, their wealth will trickle down to other people in society, and we'll all be better off if we've got these rich people around. But in fact, the reverse is the case. These people get rich in the first place because the system is so rigged. So they're sort of vacuuming up wealth from everybody else, and that is how they get so rich. So we're going to talk about personal wealth in a couple of weeks and see other aspects of the way the system is working. Okay, that's probably a good time to open up for a discussion.
Fantastic, Rod. Excuse me, extremely comprehensive.
Thank you.
It's very difficult with economics because of the nature of it. It's very heavily maths laden when you come to study it. So it's actually very an intricate part of knowledge that for a lot of people it's not accessible. So I think you've done an amazing job in terms of identifying some of the key issues that we're not taught and some of the key issues that are avoided being, I say taught, but avoided, being really, really pushed to the fore in terms of our consciousness and our understanding. It's interesting when you talked about where they stopped talking about rents from around 1900, because obviously anybody who reads Marx, for example, who, as you talked about at the very beginning, is a political economist, and he talks a lot about, and he uses a lot, of the term rents. And it's interesting that when you come to read Marx, for example, and with that rent term being used so much, because it's not part of our vocabulary in the same way anymore, it actually means that you've got to engage with these concepts from the 19th century and understand their relevance before you can actually move forward and even make sense more of what Marx is trying to get across. So that use of language is very manipulative in current thinking. But in terms of the idea of the way in which you talked about these corporations, for example, oil corporations, and I think that's one of the major issues that we have, because actually the corporate ownership across the globe is like a spider's web.
Yeah.
And because it's like a spider's web, it's in itself, again, I use this word, inaccessible, because what we know is that ultimately those companies like Esso, whatever, or that these companies who run the oil industry are also very much part of the ownership of pharmaceuticals, in terms of the arms industry, like you said, in terms of refinery. But it is like a massive spider's web, and people don't realize, because they adopt obviously whatever name or nomenclature that they want to adopt, and people don't then look at it and think, oh, they're associated with this as well, and over there. So it's actually this very, very tangled relationship of concentration of a small number of extremely rich and powerful corporations and individuals that have their fingers in multiple pies, that they do their best, and many governments, unfortunately, as well, do their best to ensure that we aren't aware of.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And in fact, there is starting to be some fairly decent research where people are looking at the problems caused by the fact. So you've got these giant companies, and then behind some of them, you've got these giant investment companies, and there's a handful of very, very big investment companies. And we might do a session on that later, but I haven't written a specific piece about that yet. Yeah. But if a gigantic investment company holds shares in one oil company and shares in another oil company and shares in another oil company, and those are the three, say, dominant oil companies in a particular region, then that investment company wants all of those three oil companies to make the biggest possible profits they can. So they have a vested interest in making sure that those oil companies are not going to compete against each other to bring prices down to the lowest sort of point. And this is one of the interesting things, that if you look in an economics textbook, it'll always be saying, oh yes, these companies will compete against each other and they'll bring prices as low as they possibly can, and that'll be wonderful for all us consumers. But in the real world, it just doesn't work like that. It's a beautiful theory in a textbook. And actually, until I was about 35, I used to believe it, but I hadn't done the research to see what was really going on. But in the real world, it's all about the power, as you say, of a small number of investment companies and big, powerful companies in each industry who very much rig the markets for themselves. And they're linked to, if you're looking at American companies, they have an immensely powerful American government that goes out of its way all over the world to manipulate the system on their behalf. And we'll talk about that in much more detail in future weeks.
And also these corporations, these investment companies, are offsetting in that they will have, let's say, 1 million shares in A, 1 million shares in B, 1 million shares in C, etc. And they know that when there's a particular issue that affects the share prices and brings them down in A, they can sell those shares, transfer those shares to, say, D, that's on the way up, and they've got people who are employed full-time to constantly move those shares around to maximize their income. And of course, even though they go out of their way to tell us that the system isn't rigged, we know that it is. And we also know that when a company is hit hard financially, it's almost without doubt the ones at the top either aren't affected or they're the least affected. And as you talked about with the example of Flint, Michigan, the the workforce, the communities are the ones that effectively face the apocalypse.
Absolutely, yeah. It's always the least powerful players.
Exactly. And so you have these skyscrapers in Hong Kong, for example, full of these extremely rich and powerful individuals who are effectively running the show on their laptops, who are barely ever affected. And yet these anonymous people on the balance sheets whose lives are destroyed, it takes a certain kind of person, don't you think, to have that power and to be able to distance yourself entirely with empathetically from these people's lives and the destruction that effectively is created.
Well, that's really interesting. So last week we were talking about psychology and how distance is one of those things that kind of makes it easier for people to do unethical things. And I have a feeling so I've actually met people who work in the sort of investment banking sector and so on. And what you do each day where you're sitting in front of a screen is you're just manipulating numbers. It's very similar to a computer game. And it's so far removed from the end consequences that most of the time they just make no attempt to even stop and think about it. So the investors, on the one hand, are kind of just playing their number games. The senior management who run these businesses, and so the people in General Motors who closed down the Flint, Michigan plant, they do see the devastation firsthand, and they are that little bit closer to it. And I think that there is a particular mindset of the most senior executives in the biggest companies that do the most ethical things, that basically, for whatever reason, partly I think this is so complex that you could never kind of summarize it. It's related to the psychology we were talking about last week, where we've built systems that encourage the most sociopathic people to rise to the top, and they really do not care about the harms that they cause to other people, and they move in circles where they're surrounded by like-minded thinkers.
Yes,
and they can avoid engaging with it. And I think that's sort of a problem with the way we create our societies, with size and complexity and distance and so on, that actually we do have insane people at the top, and they can get away with it. There is no, it's not a crime, because the people who make the laws, something we'll talk about in a future week, is how the most powerful criminals essentially make the laws. And so if you have no crimes and no serious regulations, then this is something that the financial people talked about when they were interviewed after they brought down the financial system in 2008. Lots of books were written about it, lots of people were interviewed, and they just said, well, listen, if everybody else in every other company and in your own sort of trading floor is doing all of these unethical things, then what is right and what is wrong? The law or the regulation ceases to be something that you don't break. It ceases to be a kind of thing that you try to get around. It's a cost of doing business.
Yes,
and so
yes,
so
yes.
The whole morality changes when it becomes a kind of large scale thing that's how the system works. And so I think we need to really get lots of people engaged in having a conversation about saying, listen, we have to create systems where this is not the norm. You know, a big company has to operate within some sort of ethical framework. And again, that'll be the focus of next week's discussion.
Yes, and I think the ethical framework in itself, if you have an organization, it gets to a certain size. Let's say you employ 1,000 people. Once you've got to that size, you're almost committed to playing the unethical game, because it only takes a fluctuation in the market that means that you suddenly make big losses on a particular, let's say Flint, Michigan. You make big losses, and ultimately the only way to get around that is to transport everything abroad, where you can pay a third of the wages. There is no health and safety, there is no unionization. So it becomes a much more simple way for you to make money abroad, out of sight, out of mind. And as long as you are in bed with the government and there's a few bribes that have taken place along the way, and therefore, I guess, Flint, Michigan just dies, and eventually over 3 or 4 decades, it rebuilds in a different way. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think you get to a certain size that either you play the game, or the risks involved in you being kicked out of the game or losing are become greater, because you're not dumping off the coast of Africa and driving the Somali fishermen out. You're not taking absolutely no responsibility for the Union Carbide in Bhopal, where the state and corporations effectively did everything on the quiet to compensate, but they made damn sure that they didn't take the responsibility too publicly because of the impact it would have, etc., etc., etc. So the whole system needs to be radically changed before individuals can gain from an ethical parameter.
Yes. So I think there's some truth in that it does become very difficult, and you hear executives say this if they're interviewed about it. They'll say, "What choice did we have? All our competitors were doing this, and we have to be globally competitive." And they've created this mindset where they see the whole world's economy as this place to compete. The term competition needs to be interpreted in a slightly odd way, because what I was saying earlier about companies not competing, where they kind of rig things to their own advantage, is still very much the case. But at the same time, they use the argument that they have to compete because if they employ thousands of people in Flint, Michigan, and they don't employ thousands of people in Mexico or China, then obviously they'll go out of business. And interestingly, it is the case that the vast majority of car companies don't make profits, certainly not very often. And so there is a sort of, in some industries, there clearly is an issue about at what price do you produce. But I think once you go down the route of saying, well, it's kind of out of our hands, if you're a big company, you have to do these terrible things, then you end up really screwing up society. Yes. And so we need to actually take control of that debate and say, listen, we don't have to make the whole global economy a giant competition. We can focus on, the quality of life for people in Britain and the living standards of people both here and overseas, if we use them as our suppliers or subcontractors. And we can actually create a much more ethical international framework. And in fact, the International Labour Organization has been wanting to do this for decades. And in fact, the UN has attempted to do it as well, where for many years, for about 20 years, they discussed coming up with a code of conduct for international companies. But there were so many vested interests who fought against them that eventually, after 20 years of trying, they gave up. And the International Labour Organization has never got anywhere with introducing something like a global minimum wage or better standards for people in poorer countries. And at the moment, all of the people with power and all the organizations with power like the system as it is, because it enriches the few at the top of society. It enriches the shareholders, the executives, and the politicians who collaborate with them. And this is the case all over the world. So you have elites in each country who benefit from the current system. And so it really will require an enormous effort to completely change the system.
Yeah, and I think we're reaching the 50th anniversary, to be fair, of this snowball rolling down the mountain, because I think it was that early mid-1970s, that reaction to the 60s, and whether it's intended or unintended consequences, we ended up very quickly with the Reagan and the Thatcherite economics of the 80s, which fed on from the IMF, in this country in the 76. So whether there was ideologues in the background who saw an opportunity, or whether it's just a snowball rolling down the mountain and getting bigger and bigger, is another issue. The last thing I want to discuss, Rod, is when you talked about the free market and the fact that the inequality that is so inherent within the system actually prevents that taking place. And one of the things that I've sort of tend to throw back sometimes at people about when they talk about the free market and they insist that there is a free market, is I say, okay, well, we do have this inequality. So straight away, your argument, is dead in the ground. However, let's assume, for example, that we adopt an egalitarian approach across the globe, and everybody has their wealth income distributed in such a way as we all start off at the same point. Then you allow the free market to take place. But what will happen very quickly is inequality.
Yes.
So that every child then it comes into that system is being born into a system again that's very much unequal. So in actual fact, the process by which we've done all this completely radical organizing in order to be able to have a free market, so everybody's at the same starting point, the starting point, it vanishes really, really quickly. And we inherently and forever will have to be reorganizing society to enable it to be an equal starting point. So it's just entirely unfeasible.
So it's a really good point. And in fact, there's a very good economist called Paul Ormerod who wrote a book some years ago called Butterfly Economics. And he was talking about all sorts of aspects of the economy. But one of the things he did try to analyze, and in fact, various other people have tried to do computer simulations showing the same thing, is saying that let's say you start out with 100 small, approximately equal businesses, but you have a kind of set of graphs. It's 100 columns, if you like, in a computer simulation. And the size of the graph represents the size and power and profit of the company. And you start out with 100 small ones, kind of all just kind of operating as small businesses. But you allow them to buy each other up, and you allow one to be placed in a slightly better location than another. You allow them to do a bit of advertising, a bit of marketing. What you find always is that you end up with one or a small handful of big, powerful companies. And you're absolutely right that you can never maintain equality. So in fact, this is why I feel that to try to kind of create a level playing field and continually to reinvent the level playing field and kind of rig the rules against those who are more successful all the time isn't really a viable way to go, because there's something really important about economics, and that is when you're producing something like cars, it definitely is easier to make loads of them if you're producing at scale. It's very, very hard for small car manufacturers to meet the sort of safety testing and the crash testing and so on. If you're making millions of cars every year, then that sort of initial design and testing phase becomes a much smaller part of the whole process. So there is such a thing, economists call this economies of scale, and it is very important in some industries. And actually we do want some industries to be operating at scale. So you're never going to actually want large numbers of tiny little businesses in some industries. So then you have to say, well, if you are inevitably going to have big, powerful production processes in some industries, you have to remove the profit motive from those industries. And so we have to run them for the benefit of society. And this is why I was saying that there are all these industries where some economists talk about the concept of a natural monopoly. So if you look at the water supply system, you only want to build one set of water supply pipes all over the country. You don't want 10 different companies all laying water supply pipes all over the place and then trying to compete with each other. So you have one natural monopoly. And the same is true of the sort of railway infrastructure. So where you have a natural monopoly, it makes sense to actually run it for the benefit of society and to try and remove the profit motive. But yes, it is very difficult to convince people who've been conditioned into the what I call the worship the market approach all their lives, which is what's happening every day if you watch the mainstream media, to say, hang on a minute, the system really does not work as you believe it to work. It takes time for them to question their belief systems.
Yeah, and just a very final point. When we look at the sociology, for example, of the workplace and the production line processes that we have now, and you look very much at Fordism and the fact that people take individual responsibility for different parts of the production line process, and then you compare it with what this Swedish model, which was trying to retain a lot of the past and the ownership with the making of Volvos, and there was a lot smaller groups of people involved in making the Volvo than pretty much in any other aspect of the car industry globally. And they had much greater skill base, they had much greater ownership. They actually were given a Volvo car themselves if they worked there on the production line. So there was a much more of a feeling, as I say, of attachment. to what they were making. And obviously Volvo was for a long time, I'm not sure the situation now, but for a long time was seen as a safe, sturdy car, made in a safe, sturdy model, so to speak. So I don't know if you have anything about the Swedish model of making Volvos, that less so now because they've obviously had to compete, as we talked about, but they managed to retain it for a lot longer than most.
I'm afraid I haven't actually studied the Swedish sort of car manufacturing system, so I suspect you know a great deal more about that than I do. So I'll have to research that sometime. I do occasionally think that what we need is lots of people trying to research how different countries do certain things. So, for example, it's my understanding that in Finland, they take how companies operate, so they call it corporate governance, much more seriously. And they ensure that if they're going to set up a contract with a small company overseas, so as a subcontractor, they make sure that that's a fair contract and the people in the subcontracting company are treated well and they have certain minimum working conditions and so on. And I think it would be interesting to look at how that is across the board. And if there are really positive examples of how these things work in some countries, then it would be worth saying, well, why aren't we adopting that either as a national standard ourselves or as a more international standard?
And it comes back to the lobbyists, their power, their influence on our particular government. Brilliant, Rod. Thank you so much yet again for an extremely interesting discussion. I know that we're going to be continuing our analysis of economics into the future, but this is a great place to start. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on again.